for discussion with Congressman Seth Moulton.
Hey, how are you, Seth?
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Congressman, we're the last thing standing between them and a cocktail. So
Not a good place.
I know, like as we've been in the line of fire, but this is real. Okay, Congressman Seth Moulton is a Marine Corps veteran who served 4 tours in Iraq, leading one of the first units into Baghdad during the 2003 invasion. Congressman Moulton was elected to Massachusetts' 6th District in 2015. He exhibited, in my personal opinion, a profile and courage when he was one of the first sitting members of Congress to speak openly about post-traumatic stress. And he co-authored the legislation that created the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. He's now leading the push for a $200 billion national plan to bring high-speed rail to America, which we'll talk about. He holds a lot of degrees from Harvard University, but I think the most important is the one from Harvard Kennedy School.
Of course.
So please welcome Congressman Moulton.
Thank you. Chris, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, man. So let's start with an easy one. It's a hard time to be in politics. Why do you do this job? Because it doesn't look like a good one from where most of us are sitting.
I thought you were going to ask why I didn't join the Marines, not the Army. But look, it's an honor to be here with Dan Goldman, who's a more recent veteran of Congress, so maybe he hasn't seen it as bad yet as I have. But look, it is a frustrating time in politics, frankly. And this is a question I get from a lot of my friends who actually just care about me and maybe my own mental health. They're just like, Seth, why do you keep putting up with this? Why do you do this job when there's so much partisanship, so much division, death threats to your family? I mean, that's like part of the territory right now with being in Congress. But I think there's two fundamental reasons. One is that this is still the best system of government in the world, and as imperfect as it is, you need Congress to run America. You need Congress to try to put a check on the president. But it's still the best. It's the best hope in the world, and we've got to work to make it better. And I think one of the proudest traditions of the Kennedy family is that fundamental American tradition that when you see something not as good as you'd like it in the world, you volunteer to make it better. Because America is a country that's never gotten it all right, but has always believed that it might. And we need volunteers and public servants like Dan to stand up and try to have that impact and try to fix our government when it's broken. But a better answer to that question is an experience that I had speaking to a school group. You speak to school groups on the Capitol steps and they want their picture with you. And I had this testy group of middle schoolers, one of whom said, like, what do you do in there? As in, like, what do you do that makes a difference in my life? I was like, okay, that's a good question.
That's good.
And so I talked about 988, the mental health hotline. Because it's probably a bill they were familiar with. There are 988 posters all over schools, and a lot of kids know people who have been able to use the line for help. So I shared some of the statistics, like the fact that in its first year, calls to 988 were up 50%, which is a huge, and it's amazing how many more Americans are getting help. Something like over 95% of calls result in a life-saving intervention. So that's thousands of lives saved a month. But even more impressive is it texts to 988, which in many ways is a proxy for youth mental health in America. Texts were up over 1,500%, which of course is an amazing measure of the kids who are getting help, but also a measure of the need. And it turns out that middle schoolers are not impressed by statistics at all. They were like completely stone-faced. So I took my picture with them. But then a woman from another group came up and interrupted me and said, sir, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I just want you to know that your bill saved my daughter's life. And then she introduced me to her 13-year-old daughter. And that's why this work still matters. It's still important.
All right, I've got a couple stats on the 988 hotline for us. So, handled 10.8 million contacts since July 2022, calls, texts, and chats, including 1.4 million from the Veterans Crisis Line. And in May 2024 alone, 500,000 contacts, marking a 33% year-over-year increase. So, one, I think you have definitely saved a lot of lives with that. My question is, why is that number keep going up? Like, what is your perspective on the mental health epidemic in America? Is it social media? Is it, what is it?
Things are getting a lot worse. And I think that we'll see the data is obviously still coming out, but we're also going to see a dramatic rise of calls to 988, mental health emergencies, specifically under the Trump administration, because people are freaking out for good reason. And so that's one thing. I mean, another thing, frankly, is that the whole goal of having a 3-digit number that everyone can remember. So in the same way that you wake up in the middle of the night and your house is on fire, you don't go looking for a phone book to figure out the number for the fire department. Everyone knows 911. Well, now more Americans just know 988. And so it's dramatically increased the accessibility for mental health. Because in some ways, when you look at the mental health problem in America, there's two fundamental things you could do. One thing is increasing access to care. That's what 988 does. It just makes it easier to get access to care when you or a loved one needs it. But the second thing we got to really work on is the stigma. And I always thought of 988 as a solution to access, but not to the stigma. And what surprised me is when we passed the legislation, the publicity around it just fueled conversations that weren't happening before. And I've had an enormous number of Americans from across the country come up to me and just say, thank you for starting a conversation that now I've been able to have with my family or with my friend. I had members of my own staff right after we passed that bill come up to me, I mean, including one I worked with almost every day, and saying, by the way, I've been seeing a therapist for years. But he didn't feel comfortable sharing that until this became part of the national conversation. So it's two things. The mental health crisis is getting worse in America, but it's also an encouraging sign that more people feel the willingness to get help.
So let's talk about our veterans for a minute. And when I was we carried these things around. I was in 2011 through 2014, where I think something like 70 veterans, a veteran was dying every 70 minutes, something like that. And we carried around these ACE cards, is what they were called. And you had to have them in your pocket at all times. A commander could check, or you'd get in trouble or something. And it stood for ACE: ask if your buddy's doing okay. Care if they start showing signs that they're going to kill themselves, like they start giving away all of their worldly possessions. And escort them to a mental health professional if you need to. So that was like the number one tool that the United States military had to stop suicides, which were killing more troops than were dying in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I mean, give us just a sense of kind of where we are with veteran mental health today. I know those numbers have moved, and then I know also, in the big beautiful bill, we're cutting access for our veterans. So maybe just a little color on where we are.
Well, I think the first thing to know is that we really have done a lot of work to successfully reduce the stigma of getting mental health help in the military. And I was in the Marines like just a few years before you, so just a few years before before you got into the Army. They told me I wasn't smart enough to join the Army just around the same time they were telling you weren't handsome enough to be a Marine. But when I was in 2003, 2004, I mean, we had one of the absolute heroes of our battalion who had this extraordinary hand-to-hand combat encounter in Iraq and was awarded a big medal for it, came home, and guess what? He had some post-traumatic stress from that experience. And he acted out. He didn't do anything too serious, but the battalion's response was to just discipline him and to try to kick him out. They were successful, which means that this hero of the Iraq War, who made a few mistakes because of post-traumatic stress, was then disqualified for care from the VA because of the way he was discharged.
Right.
And that was 2004, right? And so the fact that by 2011, we're actually proactively saying, hey, take care of your buddy and talk about mental health issues is a huge amount of progress. And I've always thought that when we take care of veterans and active duty military personnel, and they show America that they're willing to get help for mental health issues, that sends a great that's a great example to set for the rest of the country, right? You can think about it in the positive preventative aspect as well. You have some of the top tier special forces, special operators today practicing mindfulness, proactive mental health care, like the same way that we just try to stay in shape physically. And what a great example to set for the rest of America. Because if that Green Beret, if that Delta Force operator can use mindfulness training, maybe that's okay for me to try too. So we have made a lot of progress. But of course, we also know the statistics that you're much more likely to die from suicide, by suicide if you're a veteran, that a lot of veterans are not able to get help. And an experience that I'm sure you've had, Chris, is we all know friends who have gone to the VA for mental health care and been told that there are not enough therapists available, so they're sent home with a drug or two, or more likely some cocktail. About 60% of veterans being treated for post-traumatic stress by the VA are on at least two drugs that affect their central nervous system, and we don't really even understand how those drugs interact. Only about 15% of veterans who come, so 1 out of 8 veterans who comes to the VA and says, I need to see a therapist, actually gets to see a therapist. So we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
I've lost 2 Marines from my platoon since we've gotten back. I'm not proud of that, but, and we really, especially that second platoon, we had a reunion just earlier this summer, and there's not a single Marine that I know of in the platoon who has not had, myself included, some issues with post-traumatic stress. Which, by the way, one of my fellow Marines, one of my best friends from the Marines, said once to me, you know, Seth, we should really call it post-traumatic stress, not post-traumatic stress disorder, because after what we went through, it would be a disorder if you weren't affected by it, which is really true, right? So it's totally a natural human response to, you know, these traumatic experiences. So it's nothing to be shunned. But the fact that, I mean, sadly, it took, I think, losing these 2 fellow Marines for us to really be proactive about it. But now we actively hold reunions and start conversations. So, you know, we're drinking beers around a fire at like 1 o'clock in the morning, as you would expect Marines to do. And one of the Marines just said, okay, all right, go around the circle. You know, what are the challenges you're dealing with? Who's got mental health issues? And I was like, wow, that's amazing to be happening in this group. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we have come a long way.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I found that the moment after the fall of Afghanistan was this like really big moment in my circle, where guys were calling and texting, and that was not only a moment of camaraderie and brotherhood, but also people really struggled with that moment.
And still do.
Still do.
And obviously, I'm not an Afghanistan veteran myself. I was just in Iraq.
Congressman Moulton went to Afghanistan just because he wanted to see it. He said he said he'd been to Iraq 4 times, and you wanted to just go check out Afghanistan one time.
Yeah, I got a summer job as a reporter. Just seemed like a natural thing to do.
Let's go check it out.
Yeah, they kind of hired me just because I was like, you know, the ex-hockey player who doesn't really know how to call the plays but can be a color commentator, right? Explain what's going on behind the scenes. We got there, and of course, like immediately like had to pay a bribe to get into the country. I mean, not that I've ever violated the FAR, whatever. Dan's a prosecutor. I'm probably gonna get in trouble for that. But basically, the news organization was like, okay, we need to use your Marine connections. I'm like, look, no, I'm not a Marine here. I'm here as a graduate student and a reporter. We're not talking about the fact that I was in the Marines. We got embedded with a Marine unit, and the gunny who came out to literally meet our helicopter was my first squad leader in my first platoon.
Wow.
So the Marine Corps is
Right
very
away.
small.
Right. Very
Cover
small.
blown immediately. But it was a fascinating summer.
Okay, with a couple minutes left, let's shift gears just a little bit, because let's talk about high-speed rail. We love trains in my household. We dream of going on fancy trains in Europe. But I do
But
not
not here,
dream
and I
of
want you
taking
to
the
dream of
Amtrak.
doing it
Yeah, so
here.
tell me
Yes.
why we should dream of taking Congressman Moulton's high-speed train across America, and what that means for...
Because my house is exactly 90 miles from the Margaritaville Resort. 90, I checked it, right? That would be a 30-minute trip by conventional high-speed rail. It would be shorter, closer to 20 minutes by the new Chinese standards. They're really setting the new standards in the world. And even if we didn't have high-speed rail in Massachusetts, but just had kind of like normal fast rail, it'd be about an hour to get here by train. And I almost missed this talk because it took 3 hours to drive here. Now that's insane. So for those of you who can relate to Massachusetts, you know that you cannot live in Salem like I do and have a job on the South Shore, or be married to someone who might want a job on the South Shore, even though it could be 40 miles away, because you cannot get there, certainly not at rush hour. But imagine if you could live in Salem and be in downtown Boston in 20 minutes and continue on the same train to Hyannis and get there 40 minutes later. That's not crazy Hyperloop, whatever stuff that Elon Musk says is going to happen and never does. It's reality in the rest of the world. And so we just need to build it here. And at this time when so many people are focused on tearing down institutions and resisting Trump and stopping all the destruction that's going on in our government, I want to be someone who actually talks about the things that we can build. And high-speed rail is something that would dramatically change lives in America. And it's not just where you think, like, okay, yes, there would be a train every 10 minutes to New York and to Washington. There would be no more flights in the Northeast Corridor, because why would you get on a plane when it takes the same amount of time as getting on a train? I mean, you could be in a luxurious European-style high-speed rail car, or you could be stuffed in a pressurized aluminum tube 30,000 feet in the air praying that the door doesn't blow out. So which would you choose? And if you miss that train, at Union Station to go back to New York, oh shoot, I gotta wait 9 minutes for the next one, because that's how frequent the service would be with that level of service on the Northeast Corridor. But actually the most popular high-speed rail line in the world is Beijing to Shanghai, and that's about the distance from Atlanta to Chicago. So just think about how transformative high-speed rail service would be between Atlanta and Chicago. Now, we usually think about that in terms of the infrastructure we have today, and you're probably thinking, wow, Atlanta's a really congested airport, and O'Hare is notorious, so you would be great to relieve some of that pressure. And that's true. It would be great for the economies of Atlanta and for Chicago. But imagine what it would do for all the economies in between. And that's the amazing thing about high-speed rail. In a country that right now is politically divided, is economically divided, high-speed rail makes it possible to live in flyover country and work in these big cities, because you can take a train in a very reasonable amount of time from Boston to Chicago. It doesn't just serve Boston and Chicago, it serves South Bend and Buffalo and Syracuse and Rochester. And that's transformative for those cities. So there is a great future to be had if we can have a bold vision of building. But it also requires, us Democrats to get out of our own way. And, I worked on a high-speed rail project in Texas, and even in Texas, the biggest obstacle to building high-speed rail were the environmental reviews. And if environmental reviews stop a 10-lane highway from tearing through the middle of a beautiful city, that's a great thing. But when they stop something that's fundamentally good for the environment, we've got a problem.
So maybe, Jordan, can we queue up a question? I got one more question for Congressman. What California high-speed rail, everyone already knows I'm a big fan of Ezra Klein. He writes about it in his book. And he says, in California, it's going to cost $35 billion to build 500 miles of high-speed rail, and it's already taken a decade and won't start carrying passengers until 2030. In that amount of time, they built 23,000 miles in China.
Yep.
So I guess the question is, why is this time different here, either in Massachusetts or across the country, and what do we have to do different?
Well, I think one thing is this is going to require bipartisan leadership, and it's going to require Republicans to say, yes, we should be the best in the world, and we don't all just have to be driving cars. And it's going to require Democrats to say, we need to do this less expensively. We need to say, hey, something that's fundamentally good for the environment, let's expedite some of the environmental reviews. And those things would dramatically bring down the cost. I actually did a sort of independent study for a semester in business school looking at California high-speed rail, and we came to two fundamental conclusions. This is back in like 2011. One, it's going to cost more than they say. Big surprise. But two, and this is the part that's so often left out of the discussion, it's still less expensive than building the airports and highways necessary to meet future travel demand if you don't build high-speed rail. So like, there's not some vast high-speed rail conspiracy that's infected the entire world, and it just hasn't come here. No, it just makes sense. It's a really good return on taxpayer investment. That's why Morocco, that doesn't have a lot of money to mess around with, is building high-speed rail. Morocco has a third the GDP of just the state of Massachusetts, right? And they're building high-speed rail. They're building, in fact, their high-speed rail line is about the same length. They're expanding it now, but right now it's about the same length as Boston to Springfield. So imagine being able to get on a train in Springfield and be in downtown Boston in 40 minutes. That could solve the housing crisis in eastern Massachusetts overnight, right? If we just did what Morocco is doing. So we can do this, folks. Like, the United States of America can do this. But we've got to wake up and realize that it's an investment worth making. Does that answer your question, Chris?
I killed it.
I can talk for a while about high-speed rail.
Tell Ezra to print a retraction. Do we have any questions? Oh, yeah, Dr. Ostrovsky, always. Let's do it.
Congressman, thank you so much. I was a refugee from Ukraine in 1989, came to the U.S. for what Chris described as the American dream. I got to live it, became the chief medical officer of the National Medicaid program because of sacrifices by people like you. So thank you on all fronts. I genuinely appreciate it. I have two questions. Feel free to answer one or both. One is, I'm a donor to a bunch of clinicians running for Congress. I've fundraised for 2 clinicians in the Democratic Doctors Caucus. There's 6 total. I'm curious, how seriously do people take the Democratic Doctors Caucus? Is it just a newspaper headline, or is it real? Is there any critical mass? The other question is, I know we're talking about AI a lot. I don't believe too much in AI. I do believe, though, in things like psychedelics, especially the science around use of psychedelics for treating refractory mental illness, especially in veterans. And I think it may be one of the only issues where Democrats and Republicans, veterans in particular, can agree on advancing legislation. Where do you stand on advancing research funding and then coverage for and reimbursement for use of psychedelics for things like PTSD or other refractory mental illness? And thanks again.
Sure. Great questions, and I'll try to move concisely through. I mean, first of all, you may not believe in AI, but AI might believe in you, so you better be ready for this. Psychedelics, I think, are an interesting. I mean, I think the bottom line is that there actually is some good data and science to support at least studying this further and giving more people opportunities, because I think we all know, I'm sure you know, Chris, some veterans anecdotally who have really benefited from psychedelics. And we don't have like a clinically proven or like a, there's no pill you can take for post-traumatic stress. That's why the VA is giving people these cocktails that they don't even understand. And so I think it's absolutely something worth pursuing. And I'll just mention, because I didn't mention it earlier, that 988 seems like such an obvious thing to do. And people are like, well, why didn't we think of that sooner? It was actually remarkably difficult to get this legislation passed. And I did it with a veteran across the aisle, an Air Force veteran who showed some real political courage, because mental health is not usually a Republican issue. And he and I worked together to get it done, and we had to get Donald Trump to sign the thing. I'm not sure what mental state he was in at the moment, but he did sign it. And that was there were all these fights over funding. There was even a brutal fight over what the number should be. I mean, it was crazy. Like, this shouldn't be so hard. But it's a great example of where bipartisanship matters. And then on the Doctors Caucus, look, I just think that it is important to show people, to show Americans, that Congress can believe in science. Whether it's doctors or physicists. I mean, I'm one of the only members of Congress with a degree in physics, which, by the way, is pretty awesome, because for everyone in life who sees my resume and not my transcript, makes me sound really smart. But that background, it's like we can't just, no offense to the lawyers here, but we can't just have a whole bunch of lawyers and politicians. Like, we need people who actually bring the credibility of the hard sciences to these debates, because that's really lacking right now.
Let's do one more. Someone's got to have a question. I know it's cocktail time, but there it is. Nate.
Thanks for your service. I'm curious on what you thought about Ross and Limbic when you were hearing about the application of AI in things like therapy and mental health care settings, and the thing about the 988 hotline and how much SMS and text is exploding with younger demographics. Do you think, or what is your perspective on the application there, especially in a crisis setting?
So unfortunately, I was fighting traffic because I was not able to be on a high-speed train, and so I missed the discussion. But I will talk about AI in general because it is something we're talking about a lot with mental health, because I shared that statistic about how only 1 out of 8 veterans who goes to the VA actually gets to see a therapist because there just are not enough therapists. So there's a lot of discussion right now in the mental health community about what role AI can play to help. And I think there's a lot of very legitimate concern about using just AI as a therapist, at least with where AI is right now. I'm sure many of you have heard horror stories of people, developing uncomfortable relationships with AI because they need help. But there is some good evidence that that AI, or at least basic machine learning, can help diagnose and triage. So, when I shared my story about dealing with post-traumatic stress after my time in Iraq, I talked about a 3-point mental health program. And one was a 3-digit national number, so we've got that done. A second was increasing access to care for veterans and active duty service members, and I've passed a couple of bills, including the Brandon Act, that make it a lot easier for active duty personnel to get mental health assistance. Because, as I said before, it also sets a great example for everyone else. But the third plank that I threw out there was really getting to this parity question that Patrick has been so instrumental in pushing. Because if I told you that, hey, tomorrow I've got to go get a physical, you wouldn't come up to me at cocktails and say, oh my gosh, I hope everything's all right. But if I said, I've got a mental health appointment tomorrow, you might think, gee, I wonder what's going on with him. Because we're just not used to having routine or preventative care for mental health, and I'd like to get to that point. And so I've talked about just making it normal that everyone from high school on would have an annual mental health exam, just like a checkup. And maybe you're totally fine, but the doctor says, you could be doing some mindfulness training, it might make you even mentally stronger or more resilient, right? So that's the dream of getting to that point where we totally normalize mental health care, where we are with physical health care. And if we're going to do that, we just need a lot more therapists. And it may be that AI could help at least bridge that gap, at least help identify and triage who are the people who really need help, and make it easier for everyone to say, hey, I'm going to have a checkup.
We call it the checkup from the neck up.
Love it.
Beautiful. On that note, please thank Congressman Moulton for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Chris.
That was awesome.